This is Defender Radio. I'm Michael Howie, and this is Defender Radio, the podcast for wildlife advocates and animal lovers, brought to you by the Fur Bearers. Portrayal of interactions between humans and coyotes, content analysis of Canadian print media 1998 to 2010, isn't the most enthralling of titles. But the study below it had a significant impact on my career and how I perceive and engage with the media. The paper, which appeared in Cities and the Environment 10 years ago, looked into how coyote interactions with people are discussed in the media. The findings floored me when I first read the paper, and they remain a part of media sensationalism seminars I've given over the course of the last decade. Rather than try to explain what this paper was all about, I'm going to skip ahead to the interview with co-author of the study, Dr. Shelley Alexander of the University of Calgary. But first, I wanted to let you know that Defender Radio and The Switch are going to have an awesome giveaway starting next week. That's the first week of November. To make sure you get the details, follow me on Instagram at HowieMichael and sign up to receive email updates at defenderradio.com or thefurbears.com. Just make sure you click that you want updates about Defender Radio. Links are in this week's show notes. The contest starts the first week of November, so stay tuned. Now, here's Dr. Shelley Alexander sharing her views 10 years later of 10 years of media content analysis, her own experiences with sensationalism, and how they've impacted her role as a researcher and educator. Take us back to 2011 when you were working on the paper with your colleague. What was the driving hypothesis or the concept behind it? And what were the immediate takeaways from the Portrayals in Media study?
I think at that time, it was just getting there were two things. It was getting a basic understanding of the phenomenon and how the reactivity or the searching for a sensational title or the words that are used within articles might change people's perspective on coyotes or might fuel the negative reactions that people have or the negative sentiments they have, and also just to get a baseline of that understanding, because at the time I had been working with coyotes for a while and was shifting into more of the human dimensions and human perception and that, and there had been other research done at that time that spoke to this issue of the media's role in escalating people's fear in the words or the selection of words that they would use. And so there was interest in it just, I think, academically in doing it, but also practically in that we might be able to help people understand how they might be manipulated by the media portrayal. Yeah. And then the second part of it was to actually use the media to get a sense of what kinds of events were going on with coyotes across Canada. So, the study that I had set up was in the city of Calgary, so it was fairly narrow in scope. And we were looking at conflict within the city at that time. But media content is also a good way to understand what's going on within society or within just problems that are being faced or challenges that are being faced, because it's a place where these get recorded, and research leading up, to this shows that it's actually as valuable a way to get a finger on the pulse of what's happening as doing questionnaires and mail out questionnaires or surveys about topics. And so it seemed like a novel way to try to get at this question of what kinds of events are happening between people and coyotes and pets and coyotes across Canada. What are people concerned about? How are these problems resolved? And anything else that would emerge out of that. Now, following on that thought of what emerges is that part of the approach that we used in this is called grounded theory. And that is about looking for emergent phenomenon. So you're not going in specifically with questions that you want answered. You're looking at these to see what emerges as the important topics that are happening in society at this time. And so the coyotes are just the focal thing you're looking at. You might have a couple of questions you're interested in, like how often are people being involved in really negative encounters with coyotes. But the way you use grounded theory is for it to tell you what are the important. The data speaks to you, and you find the themes that emerge as what's important in there.
Okay, so it was very much not just looking at the words being used in the media over time, but also then trying to identify what areas of interest there were related to coyotes and what people might be thinking or feeling related to all of this kind of stuff going on around those issues.
Yeah, that's correct. And I think, but one of the things just to keep in mind with that is that, you have kind of a general idea going in like that, like you want to just understand basically what are people thinking, feeling, what's happening, get a pulse on that. But as you go through this form of analysis, all of these subtle things start to come up. All these other avenues of investigation start to come up, like things like, what are the factors that in the landscape that might influence someone's dog being attacked by a coyote or a person ending up in a negative situation. So you're able to use it to get more details on things you might not even realize are important to society at that time.
Yeah, and there's one element that I believe it came out of this one, which is the 93 or 94% number, and we'll circle around to that. But in terms of, it's 2011, this has now been published. What were the takeaways that you got from that final version of the study as it was published?
Now, are you interested in, sorry, Michael, are you interested in the media content for a portrayal or both aspects of the media content, because it was published into two different papers?
Right. I think the media aspect is that's the focal point. The
media portrayal.
Yeah, media portrayal.
Yeah. Okay. So I think the biggest takeaway there was the amount of negative language and volatile language used to describe events and encounters with coyotes that were usually quite benign. And then the other was the actual rarity of negative encounters that happen. But there were also some other really interesting trends that showed up there, including things like the change in the language that's used by media over time, from things like maybe just the descriptors like, it attacks or it was a brazen attack. Suddenly there was a shift over to this language. It was much more criminal intent. Like it implied some kind of forethought and really criminalized the behavior, spoke of it in criminal terms, like the assailant. The coyotes would be called the assailant, or they would flee the scene. They were, marauding and stealing. And so there was a language there that emerged for about a 5-year period that really changed the way you might see the role of that animal in the environment, that they're actually almost implied that the coyotes would come in and would think about this and do this intentionally to people, as opposed to the fact they're just moving around the landscape, just taking advantage of situations that are there. So that was an interesting piece to that as well. And I think the other thing that came up is a little bit surprising. There actually was a good amount of representation of expert advice from scientists, more than I thought would be there. So there was more balance in the articles in terms of getting the educational material out at the same time. But the language that was used remained quite negative and inflammatory about, how coyotes were depicted when they were doing these acts. The other final thing there, I think that was really the stark contrast was between how the media would portray coyotes doing things like killing a pet versus people killing coyotes. And so when coyotes would kill something like a pet, they were murderers, they were killers. They would be described as ravaging the animal, ravaging the pet, leaving bits and pieces strewn around. Whereas when the media would speak to what would happen after those coyotes had done that, where a government agency or whatever would go out and kill a coyote, the language around humans engaged in that same killing was really sanitized. So you get things like we euthanized the coyote, or it was dispatched.
Yep.
And so I think that was probably, one of the more interesting things to come out of that is that dichotomy of how we talk about coyotes doing things that are natural, and engaging in behavior of getting food to survive and food to feed their families, and then we don't use any terms like that for ourselves procuring food. But then also, if we were to be reporting on somebody who had been killed, we would never use that same kind of language to describe the human perpetrator.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And so for some context for folks, around 10 years ago, I was a journalist and struggling a bit with the way things were being done in some regards. So when I'd read about environmental stuff, when I'd read about animal stuff, I'd read it and it felt uncomfortable to me. And I couldn't always say why. I had primarily written about crime up till this point, so I had a lot of knowledge of that realm. And I think it was aspects of that. So, talking about comparing coyotes to criminals or using criminal language. In crime reporting, you would never say that about a criminal or an alleged criminal, right? You would say they are alleged until proven guilty. And you would be very specific with who said what and when. And was this the police? Is this fact? Or was this some bystander's opinion? But then reading about wildlife and dogs and coyotes, all of those rules just went out the window. And that's when I came across this paper and I came across your work. And it was eye-opening for me to actually see sort of some of these concerns that have been starting to float around my head really just laid out, plain as day for anyone to read and go, oh, wow, we're not doing great at this necessarily. So I wonder too, was there a response from the media, other than me emailing you, or other publications about the clear measurable bias that appeared to be in place that came as a result of your work?
I think the interest that came around it was really more from the wildlife community. And I want to also point out that one of the things you're talking about there is sort of the rule of in media that you shouldn't stereotype.
Yeah.
And I think that was one of the and that actually was something that had been written about previously by Mark Beckhoff on this issue of stereotyping of wildlife. Anyway, so there was some prior research on that as well, but this notion of stereotyping, where in the case of a human, like you're saying, you have all these cautions in place about how you would describe that person, so that you're not prejudicing any one particular group of people by labeling that the appearance of that person. And yet, in the case of a coyote, one coyote is they're presumed to be all the same. Mm-hmm. So, if you label one that's done something wrong, and people don't think of them as actually individuals engaged in that behavior, it then extrapolates to all. So it stereotypes all coyotes that way. So, so just to add a little bit to that, but I think, I've over time, I've actually ended up working with media people directly as we're doing an article, or as an article gets released, to correct some of the language that comes afterwards. But I think people were interested in it, but there wasn't like a call out from media asking me to read that paper or response, like any sort of response to it. It was more, like I said, from the wildlife community.
Yeah. Those of us going, it's like, yeah, I know. Thanks for showing us. But no, it's been about 10 years, right? 10 plus years since the paper was completed prior to 2011. The research happened prior to that. But coyotes continue to be a part of life for everybody in Canada, or most people in Canada. And, arguably there is more presence now, and that can be attributed to a number of factors, including just surveillance technology being at the fingertips of everyone. But would you say you have seen a change? In your experience working with media, observing media, and working with wildlife in how it's being reported by and large, specifically canids and coyotes, but in general, since that 10-year point or 10-year-ago point when this paper was released?
My sense is for the most part, when I do interviews, I feel like there's more equal representation and a little less overall, a little less inflammatory language. And, I will have reporters who approach me that are, very supportive of getting the right message out. There's always the concern that if you don't know that person, you're never quite sure how it's going to get spun. But, I feel like there has been some gain and some sort of change, in a positive way about the messaging actually being a little more balanced and trying to tell the story more fully. But there's still a lot of use of inflammatory language, and a lot of times that you see something that you'll have a complete story, and the whole story is actually important. All of the facts are actually important to telling the correct story, and then just one or two will get used slightly out of context, and then or grossly out of context.
Yep.
And then all the science is lost in it, and the message can actually be very destructive in the end to the whole process. But I would say, on balance, I'm encountering more media who are very open to telling that story in a balanced way that doesn't have negative repercussions on the individual or the population of coyotes.
Yeah, I would agree. I think I see more opportunities for engagement from experts, though you definitely correctly point out that it doesn't necessarily take a lot of bad coverage to suddenly become a problem. And one bad article can, with the advent of social media, suddenly be reached by millions of people, even though it's not a quality article. Or there is misinformation or disinformation, as the case sometimes is. And I think where we saw some of this was with Stanley Park. And I just want to touch on it quickly, and we don't have to go in depth, but there were two questions. One, how do you think the coverage of the 40 plus bites and other encounters will impact coexistence going forward? And this is something we've talked a little bit about off the air. And I'd also like to very briefly touch on the live interview, when two anchors during the live interview very much took what you were saying and incorrectly summarized in the form of rather explosive questions. And fortunately, you were able to correct that information, and it is now being looked at as an example in some cases of media sensationalism. But I thought, to start in this little mini section, let's talk about the coverage of the Stanley Park coyotes and how that may influence coyotes and storytelling about coyotes across the country.
Well, I think there's positives and negatives here when I look at that situation. The negatives being that there was misinformation, there were missing critical pieces of information missing from some of they may not have been missing in the original broadcast, but then they would be missing in the subsequent ones. There was, the sensationalism, would creates more of more fear and tension in public around dealing with that. The focus on the number of bites, if, oh, there's been 40 bites, rather than, there's one or two individual coyotes here that have been, very negatively affected by food conditioning and a variety of other things. Rather than focusing on those facts, the wrong pieces got focused on. And when I say wrong, I mean in that they have the potential to really distort what's going on. Mm-hmm. So instead of it being one or two coyotes, it's like people will perceive that there are, coyotes running loose, biting people all over the place, as opposed to this is an event that's been allowed to go on for a long time. And so those details are lost, and people can't really get that whole picture. And so that's a negative part that I think will have, it's become an example for people who think that coexistence isn't possible. It's become an example of look at, this is a case where, an enormous number of people are bitten. Coexistence isn't possible. That's what, can happen from this information, or this misinformation. And, so it places in question the whole process and everything that most of us who have been doing coexistence research for a long time have been trying to educate people on. So it's probably had some negative impact in that area. In terms of the positives, though, I think there were a lot of voices represented in this issue that don't normally get coverage, and it became, coyote stuff is always polarized in the media, but in this case you had just such strong opposition to and positioning these animals in a way that they haven't been positioned before, in terms of the number of people who are actually, in support of those animals, mm-hmm. being able to live their life out. And so I think that was an interesting point. It was kind of a watershed, I hope, in that sense, in that this really threw this whole issue of coexistence like right out in front of everybody. And, we've seen things happen as a result of the coverage, and the exposure of some of the aspects of it, like the fining and jailing of people who are feeding, that sets a precedent for how coyotes are treated going forward. And so I think there's positives and negatives here, but the biggest challenge is when you're a scientist and you're trying, and you feel compelled to respond to the questions because you want the facts laid out properly to help people understand the situation. And then when you see it twisted in a way where those important facts are either misrepresented, like just looking at the total number of bites, or the factors instead of the factors underlying them, or the whole thing is lost, it actually makes you not want to engage in the process. And the process itself of using and working, so not using, but working with the media to try to disseminate knowledge is so important. But the process of sensationalism actually puts you in a position where you don't want to engage as a scientist, because you spend so much time trying to undo the misperceptions that come from the wrong pieces of information being laid out there. And, I think that has the effect of the media becomes a checkpoint where we don't actually, it stops the democratization of knowledge.
Yeah, it does create an us or them situation as well, in that I have found in some of these circumstances, it becomes, well, there's the people who want something, drastic done, and there's the people who want to do science. and they're just pitted against each other sometimes too, which is unfortunate because there's so much stuff in between those 2 points. Right?
Yeah.
Like it's not just this or that. It's this vast array of possibility. But it leads into this one interview you did, and I was amazed by this. And I've written an article about it, and it's really interesting. So to summarize, you're on a live morning show. You are 1 minute and 34 seconds into your interview, and you have spent 90 seconds very eloquently explaining, I believe it's 6 different factors that go into it, which include chronic feeding, displacement of coyotes, ingested toxins and/or drugs, possible abuse, lack of enforcement, and non-compliance with rules. And the anchor comes back with, these animals might be under some sort of drug-induced rampage right now. And I remember watching that and just being like, well, that didn't just happen. That couldn't have just happened. No one could have listened to a 90-second explanation that listed 6 significant factors, all unique and all contributing to this, and walked away with drug-induced rampage. But it's what happened. And you were fortunate because this was live, you were able to speak well and interrupt and then kind of address that. And you say like, yep, okay, so I wouldn't say that, but there are a lot of different behaviors that have a lot of different things behind them. So it's not really coexistence anymore. And then the other anchor says, but you're pointing to the homeless encampment as a main reason why. To which you just respond, no, and then explain again. And it is a rare example of watching this actually happen. Of them take information being given and incorrectly summarizing it in a sensationalized soundbite to try and get you to then agree to it. And fortunately, again, you are quite skilled at this and adept at it, and were able to correct all of the information live. But what ended up happening is other media outlets would take segments of that interview or segments of your statement and run with that as if it were the entire statement. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about what that was like to sort of go through that experience and then see this result, or is it very much what you just described in talking about kind of not wanting to play anymore?
Yeah, well, I have to say that was, I was shocked as it was happening. Because, I think people don't realize how much time it takes to prepare for these kinds of interviews, because you want to boil it down to the essence, right? And in this case, I had reviewed all the lines of evidence, and I put those into what I thought were very, clear points, and also made the point that all of these things are happening as a constellation of things, right? And so when that happened, I've actually never had that. I've never had that happen in an interview where something was hijacked like that. I think 2 things here. One is that if it were not live, I wouldn't have had the opportunity. It would have just been spun out, just that one. Obviously, that one factor of I was blaming the homeless would have been spun out. And the thing was that really took me aback, because in no way would I blame the victims of society for what's going on here, right? And I was very careful on how I was explaining that it's a process of habitat degradation. Anyway, so I was quite shocked by that. But I did have the opportunity to push back. But I think, if I didn't have as much time working with the media as I do, it might have been a lot more difficult for me to actually push back and just, clarify that, because it was such an incorrect and inflammatory interpretation that it had so much potential to damage people, to damage underprivileged people, to damage the victims of society. It was making me say something that, was outside of my own value system, the way they spun what I was saying. Anyway, and it was, completely, just blotting out all of the actual, information in that. So it was really disturbing. But I think, at the end, I was like, okay, well, I'd had the opportunity to correct that, and hopefully, because it was live, anybody who saw that would have seen the corrections on that. Again, it's this example when things get boiled down to such simplistic, us and them, it loses all the nuances, and people can't. But that's I will say there was some fairly good reaction to that newscast, in that people were alerted to the fact that there were a number of factors going on here. However, it was short-lived, the idea that I might have actually been able to correct that information, because of course the media outlets then just grabbed onto, Dr. Alexander said a few things, but there's drug rampaging, there's coyotes that are in a drug-induced rampage running around Stanley Park. And, and the other that they focused on was, I think I had said in some cases there was abnormal behavior outside of the range of what we would normally see for coyotes who were food conditioned. And then, it got spun onto these coyotes are extremely abnormal. So the one animal that I was referring to, I never got a chance to really detail that it wasn't a population level thing. That became the population. And so, honestly, at the end of that, I was like, why do I subject myself to trying to mobilize knowledge through the media? Because in the end, and I've actually had this happen historically, where people react so negatively to what they presume is going on because of how the media have spun it, that they will kill coyotes as a result to settle some score with me, the academic, when I haven't even, they're perceiving something that's actually a distorted version of what I've said, and they react to that, but they actually take that out on coyotes. And so for me, it's, there's a real consequence to this kind of behavior. And, like I've said, one is the fact that if I stop speaking or scientists stop speaking, we stop that process of democratizing, knowledge and science. And that's a problem, I think. So, it has a personal effect on the person who's doing the interview. And, again, you put so much time in trying to distill these things, like hours, trying to distill what you've learned over the course of several months into something that can be, said within a few minutes, knowing that that's then going to be distilled down further. And it's not like you don't have, this is something you do in addition to doing all of the research, right? It's not a part of the research process. It's what I feel is a responsibility to society to try to mobilize knowledge, but it's not a requirement. And so I think when you have that kind of pushback, where you get that kind of, just complete and utter distortion, you really wonder why you should put yourself through that.
Yeah. And I think it is also fair to consider as you have noted, and for the general public to be aware of, is the emotional toll it takes. Again, when you're doing an interview, even just like this, a relatively relaxed interview with no time crunch and no cameras or anything like that, it still requires a degree of focused listening. Right? To make sure, am I hearing what you're saying correctly? How does that relate to the information I have? And how do I respond to what you're saying as an interviewer, let alone as the interviewee? And in other aspects of my life, I also have to do that intense listening. Even for silly things like improv humor, right? It's all about listening and really taking in a lot of information, processing it and doing something with it. And if you go through that process, and then have it kind of in one way or another dismissed or dismantled, it is an emotional shot. I think if you were to make a direct analogy, it's, well, look at this Lego castle I just built for you because you asked me to, and then the person that asked you to build it comes and kicks it down. It's like, well, why did I bother? If you just wanted to see this piece, why did you ask me to build the whole castle?
Yeah, I think, obviously, time is money, and in terms of me and time, everything is about getting the message across in the media, about getting that message across as and representing those viewpoints as diversely as possible in the least amount of time. And I think so there's always that crunch on the end of the person who's trying to put the thing together. And so you grasp it, but I think also media do a really good job when they're displaying that story of sort of, you don't see what's going on behind the scenes. And so unless you're involved in that process of doing media engagement like this, you can look at that and go, well, that must, wow, like that person just said 20 seconds worth of stuff. You don't see what's behind that, the preparation, the anxiety, the standing in front of, for some people who haven't done it, you might not realize what it takes to actually stand in front of a camera and know that you're potentially going to be scrutinized severely for what you're going to say. If it's a controversial topic, you don't know exactly how your information is going to get spun. You don't know exactly how that question is going to come at you. You prepare yourself, but you don't really know how that question is going to get rolled out until that moment. So you have to think really quickly on your feet. You have to be completely on. And so energetically, it takes a lot to do that. And so I think you're right. In the end, when you kind of have it dismantled and in a way that actually if it's spun in a completely just sensational way, it takes away all of the work that went into not just preparing that, but all of that research that you've done along the way. It trivializes it. And I think this is something that, it's an amazing process to be a part of dissemination of knowledge this way. But I think it's invisible to people, to a lot of people, as to what it takes to make that. And, you might be on for 5 seconds, but you've spent an hour in an interview, right?
I was just going to say, that's the worst. I mean, one of my favorite stories to tell, I don't remember who interviewed me, but it was some big thing about trapping. And they asked me like 15 questions. It was a 15, 20-minute long television pre-recorded interview, which is very rare to be given that much time to talk for television. And I went and I watched the clip from later that night. And it's a 2-minute long news story. And from the 15, 20 minutes I was on camera, they took me waving my arms and going, oh, I don't get it. And that's it. And I was like, what the heck? Like it was not an opinion. There was no fact. It was just me. You can see me doing this right now. The audience can't, but going, what's going on? Why are we talking? Like, it was just so silly that they even bothered putting me in the thing. Like, just don't include me. That's fine. Don't include me.
I know. I think there are points where I've done some, I've had some interviews with people where they have the coverage has just been amazing. And I think, like I say, it's more often that way now than not. And I think that this Stanley Park situation was an exception rather than the rule. But yeah, it's, I've come to a point where I try to, I wrestle between, should I never do this again? Or, for the past while, I've looked and gone, okay, well, how much damage was actually done? And is the bulk of the story, regardless of the fact that many of the facts haven't been quite correctly articulated, will they have caused damage to the coyotes? You have to weigh it out and say, is there some positives that are in here that will help the general public, feel more empowered to engage and be, with coyotes and be less fearful. So I think I try to just look at it that way, because there are going to be subtle misinterpretations in that. And that's, that's just the way it is when things are trying to get condensed. But I know when you end up in one of those situations where it's like, your arm waving example is great. Because, in that case, of course, it's not just that all that valuable information got lost. It's actually, whether it's intended to or not, it's mocking you, right? Like
a little bit, it could be interpreted that way easily.
Yeah, people will look at that and just see that they'll only see that's what looks like an emotional reaction, and that without the context is going to lead you down the wrong path. But and the other thing that I think people probably don't realize as a result of doing media is it's not like it's over, right? Like for one thing, it can continue and I think we might talk a little bit more about the Stanley Park one, but it can continue in the sense that because something like talking about coyotes is so polarizing, I will personally get hate mail following up from that. And it doesn't happen a lot, but it doesn't have to happen a lot for it to really degrade your sense of safety, right? Like, when people are threatening, they're going to harm you for what you said because they don't like what you said. They're going to come and they're going to harm you. They're going to, seek you out. It does erode your sense of safety. And again, it's just one more, that's got nothing to do with the media portrayal itself. It's got to do with this other.
No, that has to do with toxic masculinity, misogyny, and an unwillingness to learn and grow as human beings. But
the worst, I can't say that it's always. I mean, it depends on how you define masculinity, but it hasn't been men. In my case, that have been the most violent.
Interesting.
Yeah. So in terms of what they, however that's internalized when people.
It's hard. It is hard to be on the receiving end of it, regardless of how well prepared you may be or how professional you may be.
Well, and I think the thing to remember here too is that it's not like these are in the realm of things that can happen to you. I mean, it's disturbing when people do this, but I mean, at the same time, it's an incredibly privileged position to be able to be into influence. And I don't lose sight of that. And so I do try to spin it back onto, if it gets distorted, what's the damage to coyotes? Because that's the main thing. I mean, people are going to think what they're going to think about me, but if me engaging in these things is potentially going to backfire and harm coyotes, then that's my measure. And I think it's a cost of anybody who does things publicly that, people are going to react no matter what it is. It's people are going to react. So you kind of have to figure out how to deal with that. So it's not, I'm certainly not bemoaning the privilege to be able to engage in these things. It's just, I think it's that all of this kind of stuff is invisible to people. And it's not just the interviewee, I've heard in the interviewers themselves, who are harassed and yelled at. So I just think there's some intolerance in every corner, and it's challenging. But for me, like I say, the biggest thing is that is what just got reported going to harm coyotes more than it will help the general public?
I think that's a very good measuring stick, so to speak, of is this helpful or harmful? Is it helping coyotes and helping people, or is it harming people, or is it harming people's ability to manage and learn, right? Because that's the thing, is a lot of times I think people think there's more going on than there actually is, right? It's just, this is just the information. There's no agenda.
Well, and I think if anything, the message that I would love to get to media, of all forms, is that, to be cognizant of the fact that the language that is used or some of these decisions that might seem totally benign on how it's presented actually has real consequences for these animals because of the animal itself, because of there's such negative sentiment that isn't based in evidence. But there's that being aware that there needs to be ultra sensitivity about how these things are rolled out. It's not like dealing with any other species, or there's other species that are maligned like sharks and that, but you have to be extra careful with how it's dealt out, with the images that are used, because of the potential to spark fear and because of the potential to actually end up having more animals killed as a result of just the use of one wrong word. And so I think the other thing I wanted just to finish off in terms of sensationalism was, going back to the Stanley Park one, was, for people who don't know, that story went from quite a detailed, nuanced, description. It was a nice long coverage. So, I mean, on that hand, it was good. And, but because of that one, I don't know what you would call it, but the restating of what I'd said as to the homeless
the
people.
reimagining
of it to me, having said that, the homeless were to blame for the attacks by coyotes, that went and their terminology saying that, so was I saying that these coyotes were in a drug-induced rampage? That then those snippets went national. There was then media coverage that went international to the United States, and they wanted, and then because there was no context for the comments on the access to toxic substances and drugs, that was then sent to a scientist in the States who, wrote back and said, well, coyotes would never, go and. It was just totally misunderstood because the context wasn't there. And so they came back with a negative, rejecting that theory without having had the information, which then complicated the story, right? And then that same media went over to the UK and was published as, I can't remember the exact title, but it was like drug-induced coyotes attacking picnickers in Stanley Park.
It was a weird combination of actual fact and random language from other articles.
Yeah, I remember so it was drug-induced coyotes, drug-induced rampaging coyotes attack picnickers. And, so the, original story, like you said, there was there's 6 sort of intersecting factors here. And then it was gone from that to that all of these coyotes are on drugs, to not only that, it took an event that happened at 1 a.m. in the morning and used that event and called those people were called picnickers. And so it stuck all of those together into one very sensational story, which went across the UK. And so it's like, so this, all that people know then of this whole story is not the parts that matter and not the parts that we can fix and that desperately need to be addressed, but just this, this story that is there's no anchoring in reality.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's also an issue in terms of media literacy. And this will segue nicely into the wrap-up question. I do think there is an issue of media literacy right now, and I think social media has made that worse. And I think that media networks playing into the social media content game has made it worse. So by that, I mean the need to be creating new content constantly, not with the intent necessarily to create quality content, but to increase user engagement so as to increase potential advertising revenue. Like when that becomes sort of the primary focus of what you're doing and how you're doing it, or even becomes a large part of what you're doing and how you're doing it, I just think this way leads madness for media, for journalism, because at that point it is no longer news, it is entertainment. And I'm not going to say entertainment doesn't have its place. I love a fall down gag as much as the next guy, but you gotta, news needs to be fact-based. It needs to be.
Well, yeah, I mean, and I can't imagine what it's like to have to keep up as a news reporter, to keep up in that kind of sphere, because it's got to be frantic, right?
Oh,
and,
yeah.
And I think I would assume, I'm not a reporter, but I would assume that most people that go into that really have gone into it with the interest of trying to tell the story, right? And then suddenly they're constrained by this need to produce things super quickly. They always were, but now it's like you say, it's even ramped up. There's other issues though with social media that I think are important here too, and it's that it just takes this whole this amplification of fear that can happen from media, which used to happen it was a bit more delayed, right? Because it was like, there's a hard copy paper comes out, then there's a digital version of that and people have to read it and then they become upset about it. Now you're bombarded, and there's all of these apps that people have now, like Nextdoor app. And so one person will report that they see a coyote and they're afraid of what they've just seen. They have no idea what they've seen, but they interpret what they've just seen as it's walking down the sidewalk. This is an example, say, hypothetical example. It's walking down the sidewalk. And that's, it's not in a place that it's supposed to be. And so it's reported right away, with this frantic tone that these coyotes are taking over the neighborhood. They're on the sidewalk. And that then if another person down the road sees that same animal, like 3 seconds later, it gets reported again. And these look like independent events. And so overall, all these people are getting binged with this information of this. And it just starts to, I think, escalate for people, because there's this sense of, well, people are seeing coyotes everywhere, as opposed to like this one coyote walks down through the neighborhood and gets reported 16 times. So there's this issue of that. But then there's also, I mean, and these are not, I say it's hypothetical, but these are based on, things that I've seen happen in this social media platform. But then you also have things like where someone will interpret what they see. So they see a coyote and they'll say, well, this one, it was definitely 75 pounds. And based on, what they might be comparing it to something they've seen. There's nothing for them to reference it to. They may have zero experience with coyotes, and that then becomes fact. So then the neighborhood becomes frightened by the fact they think there's a 75-pound coyote roaming around. And then one other person will weigh in and say, well, it's probably a hybrid. And then that becomes like this point of, oh my gosh, they're hybridizing with our dogs, and they're hybridizing. And, all of it is false information, right? From the point of, it's biologically not possible for a coyote to be that big. And it's very easy, especially in fall and winter, for them to look much bigger than they are. 35 to 40 pounds, 17 to 20 kilograms, that's 20 kilograms would be a large coyote. So it's just not going to happen. But what's been reported in social media then becomes the fact, this idea of hybridization, right? There's no factual or no evidential basis for that, but that becomes the reality for people who are watching that. And then there's this hypervigilance, right? There's no peace for these animals that are living with this constant lens on them. And so I think, that's been a really, it's a concerning trend to me on a number of levels.
And I think some of that stuff that you're talking about, though, like the neighborhood apps, that concept, that reporting concept, has proven harmful to wildlife. So, you and I and others have looked at the media sites that will have report a coyote, and it ends up being totally wild, right? Because, half of them are foxes, some of them are dogs. Some of them have wild claims attached that are never looked into, but exist because it's crowdsourced information. And information doesn't become intelligence or news until it's been corroborated. So it's just this random bits of information with no basis to it.
Well,
but I think the other aspect that we need to look at too is the flip side of it, of people equally not seeking truth or fact, who then say, well, the coyotes are starved, so I have to go feed them. Or, right, like it is not just the negative side of media sensationalism that carries through on social. It is all misinformation. And unfortunately, the biggest one, I think, tends to be the sensational aspect of, 90-pound German Shepherd-sized coyotes coming to break into your window and steal your Honda Civic. But there is then a flip side to it. And I think that's the sort of the wrap-up point is, how can people, ordinary consumers of traditional and social media who want to protect wildlife or want to be able to do something when they see things starting to spin like this, are there things that they can do, or are there steps they can take to try and stop that spin, or at the very least create an opportunity for more fact-based education or information?
Yeah, I think, not being a media specialist myself, other than how it's used for this purpose, I don't have all the answers to that, but certainly, on the, as you say, the flip side of the negative part of the social media is the fact that there are also people on there who are excited that there was a coyote in the neighborhood, right? And so I think that becomes a place where if people are seeing a negative spin and they understand that, that observation differently, that's a place that it's really necessary, I think, to engage. Being quiet in those situations perpetuates the negative stereotype I think it's easy to look at it and say, well, I don't think that way. Most people don't think that way. But without stepping forward and negating it continues to live on as fact, or at least uncontested fact. And so I think there's a role there within social media for people who are comfortable with that, and to tell stories and to, not over surveil and take photos of coyotes in every place they see, but, to engage somehow there, because there is the offset there is that if you post too many photos of coyotes in certain places, then people who don't like them are going to go in and do something negative. But I think that there is opportunity there to really start to push out different messaging. And you see different organizations doing that, of course. Defenders does that. Coyote Watch Canada does that. I see other organizations who are nonprofits who are trying to help increase the positive ends of the stories. But I think citizens can engage in that easily, and those who are comfortable with it, with doing that. And the other part, though, is it's just questioning what you're reading and what's this, always questioning what's presented as fact and what's presented as so binary as to whether or not it actually is like that. And you've mentioned this already, there's a tendency to pit people against each other. So I might be just pitted against, I might be pitted against, the government, when we've actually said the exact same thing, but just to make the story more exciting, it's presented as if we never have a conversation. And so that's an important thing to interrogate, as well as to look at it and say, what's going on under this story, and before reacting to it, just trying to get at some of that other information that's there.
I think asking follow-up questions is such a huge one too. And that's what I still do. And people around me can attest to the fact that if you see me watching television news, I will shout at the television like it's the Super Bowl and I've got $100,000 on the game if they don't ask why in a story, or if they don't explain something in a story, because they either didn't think to do it and should have, or didn't think to include it, and I think they should have. And it's really harmful to everyone around me, because I get very aggressive about it. But
I think there's a role for sure in media literacy. And to be honest, I think people have become much more savvy to this as we've gone through the pandemic and are continuing to go through the pandemic, where that, what information is being put out there, and with things like social media platforms that are, algorithms that are biasing information. I think that the general public's becoming way more attuned to that and have been for quite a while. So it's just continuing to put that lens on and continuing to interrogate what you're reading is really important.
To check out the original study or more of Shelley's work, follow the links in your podcast app or on the show notes at defenderradio.com. I want to thank Shelley for her time, particularly since her work has made such a sizable impact on my own career. A significant part of why I am where I am right now is because of the paper we spoke about today, our early conversations, and the ensuing years of discourse between us. Shelley, and all you other researchers out there who maybe don't hear this enough, thank you for your dedication, passion, and all you've provided to the world. If you're a fan of segues, I hope you'll follow me on social media at Howie Michael on Instagram and TikTok, and Defender Radio Podcast on Facebook. An Instagram contest is kicking off for the first week of November 2021, so get a follow in by then for updates. Thank you for listening and for all you do for the animals. Until next time, I'm Michael Howie for Defender Radio and the Fur Bearers, grateful for your kindness.